August 19, 1945. The dining hall of the British prisoner of war camp outside Reading, England, fell into an unusual silence as the German women prisoners watched their Sunday dinner being served. For 24-year-old Gisela Richter, the moment felt surreal, almost dreamlike. She sat perfectly still at the long wooden table, her hands folded in her lap as a British corporal placed a white ceramic plate before her. The plate was warm to the touch, steam rising from its contents in delicate wisps that carried an aroma she had not encountered in over 2 years. Roast beef. Thick slices of it, dark brown on the edges and perfectly pink in the center, arranged beside a golden Yorkshire pudding that stood tall and crisp. Roasted potatoes glistened with butter, their skins crackling in bronze. Bright green peas formed a neat mound next to orange carrots cut into precise rounds. And over everything, rich brown gravy pooled and spread, its savory scent filling the entire hall. Gisela's throat tightened as she stared at the plate. This was not prison food. This was not even wartime food. This was the kind of meal her family might have enjoyed in Munich before the war, on special occasions, on holidays. Beside her, 22-year-old Sieglinde Braun from Hamburg leaned close and whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "Gisela, what is this? Why are they feeding us like this?" Around them, the other 50 women in their gray auxiliary uniforms sat frozen in similar confusion. Some stared at their plates with wide eyes. Others glanced nervously at the British guards who stood along the walls, watching the prisoners with expressions that seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. 29-year-old Herta Zimmermann, the former nurse from Berlin, spoke from across the table. "It must be a special day, a British holiday we don't know about." 21-year-old Adelheid Weber, who had been trying to learn English from the guards, cleared her throat and addressed Corporal Fletcher in careful, heavily accented words. "Excuse, please. Today is special day? Holiday for Britain?" The corporal, a stocky man with kind eyes and graying temples, smiled warmly. "Special? Well, I suppose Sunday's always a bit special, miss. It's Sunday roast, you see, traditional like every Sunday, if we can manage it." His words hung in the air, incomprehensible to most of the German women. Sunday roast? Every Sunday? Gisela felt something shift inside her chest, a feeling she could not quite name. She had been a prisoner for 3 months now, captured in Denmark as German forces collapsed in the final days of the war. She had expected cruelty, deprivation, perhaps even brutality. The propaganda she had believed, the stories she had been told about British treatment of prisoners, all of it had prepared her for suffering. But this abundant, carefully prepared meal served on clean plates with proper utensils, this was something else entirely, something that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her enemies. Gisela picked up her fork with trembling fingers, and the dining hall filled with the quiet sounds of 52 confused, overwhelmed women beginning to eat. 3 months earlier, May 19, 1945, the transport truck rumbled to a stop outside the gates of the British POW facility near Reading, and Gisela Richter felt her stomach clench with fear. Through the canvas covering, she could see gray stone buildings surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at each corner, and British soldiers waiting with rifles. This was the moment she had been dreading since her capture in Denmark 2 weeks ago. Everything she had been taught about British brutality, about how they treated German prisoners, flooded through her mind in terrifying images. The truck's tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and harsh sunlight flooded the dim interior. "Out! Everyone out!" The command came in English, barked by a sergeant, whose face Gisela could not see clearly through her exhausted squint. Around her, 51 other women from the German Women's Auxiliary Corps began moving stiffly toward the opening, their bodies cramped from hours of travel. They ranged in age from 19 to 34, wearing remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, many stained and torn from the chaotic final days of the war. Gisela had served as a communications specialist in Munich, operating radio equipment for Wehrmacht administrative offices. She had never fired a weapon, never harmed anyone directly, but she knew that distinction might mean nothing to their captors. Beside her, Sieglinde Braun from Hamburg moved with visible trembling. The younger woman had worked in military logistics, managing supply records. Now her carefully maintained posture was crumbling under exhaustion and terror. As they climbed down from the truck, Gisela instinctively reached for Sieglinde's hand, squeezing it briefly before military discipline forced them apart. The women formed ragged lines in the compound yard, their eyes cast downward, waiting for whatever came next. Gisela noticed how some of the British soldiers watched them with expressions she could not interpret. Not hatred exactly, but not kindness either. Curiosity, perhaps? Assessment? A British officer approached. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back severely under her cap. Captain Elizabeth Thornton, as they would later learn, walked slowly along their lines, studying each face with careful attention. "I am Captain Thornton," she said in clear, measured English that Gisela barely understood. "You are prisoners of war under protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will follow camp regulations without exception." The words meant little to most of the German women, but the tone carried weight. Not cruel, but firm. Not sympathetic, but not vindictive either. Professional. That first night, housed in barracks with metal bunks and thin mattresses, Gisela lay awake listening to quiet crying from various corners of the room. Through the single window, she could see British guards making their rounds, their footsteps steady and routine. She had expected to be beaten, starved, perhaps worse. Instead, they had been given watery soup and hard bread for dinner. Meager, but edible. Clean blankets that smelled of lye soap. A functioning latrine. The disconnect between expectation and reality left her more unsettled than simple brutality might have. The first week passed in careful, cautious routine. The German women woke at 6 each morning to the sound of a bell, washed in cold water from shared basins, and assembled for breakfast in the dining hall. The meals were simple but regular. Porridge in the mornings, vegetable soup and bread for lunch, potatoes, and occasional tinned meat for dinner. Nothing like the abundance they had known before the war, but far better than the starvation rations that had defined Germany's final months. Gisela found herself constantly confused by this basic decency from people she had been taught to hate. The women maintained strict military discipline among themselves, as if clinging to familiar structure might protect them from the unknown. They stood at attention when guards entered their barracks, kept their uniforms as neat as possible despite wear and damage, and spoke only in hushed German during their limited free time. Gisela noticed how they unconsciously grouped by age and former role. The younger radio operators clustering together, the nurses forming their own quiet circle, the administrative clerks maintaining careful records of daily routines in hidden notebooks. But the British Guards seemed determined to chip away at their defensive formality with small, unexpected gestures of humanity. Corporal James Fletcher, the middle-aged man from Yorkshire, began greeting them each morning with a cheerful, "Good morning, ladies," that required no response, but acknowledged their presence as human beings rather than faceless enemies. Private Alice Morton, one of 3 female guards assigned to the facility, noticed that several German women were coughing in the damp May weather and requisitioned extra blankets without being asked. Herta Zimmermann, the 29-year-old nurse from Berlin, found herself summoned to the camp's small medical office one morning. She went with considerable anxiety, uncertain what this meant. But the British medical officer, Dr. William Hayes, simply needed assistance with inventory of supplies and had learned she had nursing training. He gestured to shelves of bandages, medicines, and equipment with a questioning expression. Herta understood enough to begin helping, her professional training overriding her fear. Dr. Hayes worked beside her in companionable silence, occasionally offering English words for items she pointed to. And by the end of the hour, something had shifted. She had been treated not as a prisoner, but as a colleague. These small moments accumulated like drops of water, wearing away stone. When 26-year-old Mechthild Bauer from Stuttgart collapsed during morning assembly, faint from anemia and exhaustion, the guards carried her gently to the infirmary rather than leaving her to recover on her own. When 23-year-old Edeltraud Schneider from Dresden received news through the Red Cross that her brother had died in Soviet captivity, Captain Thornton allowed her privacy to grieve rather than forcing her to maintain composure in public. Gisela watched all of this with growing cognitive dissonance. These were supposed to be their brutal enemies, the British who had bombed German cities, who had fought to destroy everything Germany represented. Yet here they were, showing restraint, even kindness. At night, lying in her bunk, Gisela found herself questioning whether the propaganda had been lies or whether this unexpected decency was itself some kind of trick. By late June, the German women had settled into the rhythm of camp life, but Gisela could not shake the constant comparisons running through her mind. Every meal in the British camp triggered memories of the final months in Munich, when her family had survived on progressively smaller rations as Allied forces closed in. She remembered the gray potato soup, more water than substance, served once daily in the Auxiliary Corps barracks. She remembered black bread so heavy and coarse it hurt to swallow, mixed with sawdust to extend the meager flour supplies. She remembered the constant gnawing hunger that made sleep difficult and concentration nearly impossible. Here in British captivity, they ate 3 times daily. The food was plain, institutional, nothing luxurious, but it was regular, adequate, and occasionally included protein. Twice in the past month, they had received small portions of corned beef from tins. Last week, there had been cheese, actual cheese, distributed in careful rations, but unmistakably real. Gisela found herself putting on weight for the first time in 2 years, her uniform gradually growing tighter around the waist. The physical restoration of her body only deepened her psychological confusion. Sieglinde articulated what many of them were thinking one evening as they sat in the barracks during free time. How can they feed us like this when we were their enemies? When German prisoners in their hands get better food than German soldiers got serving the Reich? Her voice carried bewilderment rather than gratitude. Several other women nodded in agreement, their faces troubled. The question had no easy answer, and it gnawed at everything they had believed about British cruelty and deprivation. Adelheid, who had been learning English with surprising aptitude, offered a tentative explanation based on conversations with guards. Corporal Fletcher said Britain has rationing, yes, but different system than Germany, more organized, food from America, from Canada, from their empire. He said British people still eat adequately, even with war. The words sounded almost like fantasy to women who had watched German civilians starve while Nazi officials claimed Britain suffered worse. If British civilians had eaten adequately throughout the war, what did that mean about everything they had been told? Mechthild, ever practical from her years as an administrative clerk, began keeping careful notes about their daily rations, calculating calories and nutrition with the precision of her former work. "We receive approximately 2,000 calories per day," she reported to the others. According to what I remember from official documents in Stuttgart, German civilians by 1944 were receiving 1,200 calories, often less. German soldiers were supposed to receive 3,000, but supply problems meant they often received much less. The numbers laid bare an uncomfortable truth. They were eating better as British prisoners than they had as German soldiers. Herta, working increasingly in the medical office, observed another stark difference. British medical supplies, while rationed, were adequate and properly stored. She remembered German field hospitals running out of bandages, using paper in their place, reusing contaminated materials because nothing else was available. Here, Dr. Hayes maintained proper hygiene standards, had access to sulfa drugs, and even some penicillin. The contrast suggested organizational competence that German propaganda had insisted did not exist among their enemies. July brought warmer weather and longer daylight hours, and with them, Gisela found herself noticing patterns in British camp life that puzzled and intrigued her. The guards operated on schedules that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. Morning tea at 7 precisely, lunch at noon, afternoon tea at 4, dinner at 6. But beyond these meal times, she noticed something else. The way Sunday differed from every other day of the week in subtle but unmistakable ways. On Sundays, the guards wore slightly cleaner uniforms, pressed more carefully than weekday attire. Their boots shone with extra polish. Even their posture seemed different, more relaxed, yet somehow more dignified. The routine work of the camp continued, but at a slower pace, with less urgency. Corporal Fletcher whistled cheerfully on Sunday mornings, old melodies Gisela did not recognize, but which carried an unmistakably festive quality. Private Morton smiled more readily, her usual professional reserve softening into something approaching friendliness. Gisela began watching the kitchen preparations with particular interest. On weekdays, the camp cooks worked with efficient practicality, producing meals that were adequate but unremarkable. But on Saturday evenings, she noticed increased activity, special deliveries arriving from town. Through the kitchen windows, she could see larger cuts of meat being unwrapped, vegetables being sorted with extra care, flour being measured for what looked like special preparations. Whatever happened on Sundays required advanced planning and resources beyond normal daily operations. Herta, now trusted enough to move relatively freely between the medical office and other camp areas, reported back to the other women about conversations she overheard. Dr. Hayes was telling the cook about his mother's Yorkshire pudding recipe, she said one evening in the barracks, speaking in rapid German. He said it must be made properly, with the right proportions, or Sunday dinner would not be Sunday dinner. I did not understand everything, but he spoke of it like a sacred tradition, something that defines being British. The concept fascinated Gisela. She had grown up with German traditions, certainly. Christmas celebrations, Easter observances, harvest festivals. But those were special occasions, annual events marked on calendars. This British reverence for Sunday seemed different, a weekly renewal of something important to their cultural identity. She wondered what it meant that even during war, even in a prison camp far from home, British soldiers maintained this tradition with such dedication. Adelheide's improving English allowed her to ask questions directly. One Saturday afternoon, she approached Corporal Fletcher as he supervised repairs to the barracks roof. "Corporal, please explain Sunday for German women. We see different, but not understand why different." Fletcher paused his work, considering how to explain something so fundamental to his culture that he had never needed to articulate it before. "Well, miss, Sunday's the Lord's day, innit? Day of rest, day for family, day for a proper meal together. My mum, back in Yorkshire, she'd spend all Saturday preparing the roast. Dad would carve it at table, all formal-like. Made us feel civilized, even when times were hard." The word civilized resonated with Gisela when Adelheid translated the conversation that evening. The British used food, used Sunday tradition, to maintain their sense of civilization even in wartime. While Germany had abandoned such niceties in favor of total war mobilization, Britain had somehow preserved them. The implications troubled her deeply, suggesting a fundamental difference in values and priorities that propaganda had never acknowledged. As July turned to August, Gisela's understanding of the camp's weekly rhythm deepened. She began to see Sunday not as an isolated phenomenon, but as the culmination of a carefully structured week that gave shape and meaning to the prisoner's existence. Monday brought laundry duties and barrack cleaning, the camp resetting itself after Sunday's relative leisure. Tuesday and Wednesday were workdays, when prisoners who had volunteered for various tasks performed them with steady routine. Thursday brought inspections and administrative procedures. Friday and Saturday built toward Sunday with increasing anticipation. The anticipation itself became noticeable. By Friday afternoon, Gisela could detect a shift in the guard's demeanor, a lightening of mood as the week's end approached. Saturday brought the visible preparations she had observed before, but now she understood them as part of a larger cultural pattern. The British were not simply feeding themselves and their prisoners. They were maintaining a connection to home, to peacetime normalcy, to the life they hoped to return to when war finally ended completely. Mechthild, ever the administrator, began documenting the pattern in her hidden notebook. Weekday breakfast, porridge, week tea, sometimes bread. Sunday breakfast, porridge, stronger tea, bread with margarine, occasionally jam. Weekday lunch, vegetable soup, bread. Sunday lunch is different timing, later. Weekday dinner, potatoes, occasional tinned meat, vegetables. Sunday dinner. She paused, tapping her pencil against the page. Sunday dinner is something else entirely. I have watched them prepare it twice now. Real meat, fresh vegetables, proper gravy. They call it roast, and they treat it like a ceremony. Sieglinde had begun helping in the kitchen, her volunteer work earning her closer observation of the Sunday preparations. She reported back with details that amazed the other women. The cook, Mrs. Davies, she is a civilian woman from Reading who comes special. She does not work other days, only for Sunday dinner. She brings her own apron, very clean and white. She treats the meat like it is precious, trimming it carefully, seasoning it with herbs I do not recognize. The intergenerational continuity of the tradition struck Gisela as profoundly significant. This was not mere institutional feeding or military efficiency. This was cultural preservation, the British maintaining their identity through repeated ritual even in the midst of a prison camp's utilitarian environment. She thought of her own family's traditions in Munich, the Christmas goose, the Easter lamb, celebrations now impossible in Germany's ruined cities. Had the British really maintained such traditions throughout the war while Germany had abandoned them? Edeltraud, the 23-year-old from Dresden, raised a question that troubled many of them. If British people eat like this every Sunday, even during war, even with rationing, what does that say about German claims that Britain was starving and desperate? What does it say about why we were fighting? The question hung in the evening air of the barracks, unanswerable and disturbing. Every Sunday tradition they witnessed undermined another piece of the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the war and their enemies. Herta offered a nurse's perspective. Dr. Hayes told me that proper nutrition maintains health even when other days are leaner. Perhaps the British understood something about sustained endurance that our leaders did not. The first Sunday of August arrived with Gisela fully attentive to every detail of the preparations. She had volunteered for kitchen duty specifically to observe the process more closely, and Mrs. Davies, the civilian cook who came only for Sunday dinners, had accepted her help with cautious approval. The kitchen work began early, at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before the usual breakfast routine. Gisela entered the large camp kitchen to find Mrs. Davies already present, her white apron tied precisely, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. The meat sat on the preparation counter, a large roasting joint of beef that must have represented significant expense and resource allocation. Mrs. Davies ran her fingers over it appraisingly, checking the marbling, the color, the quality. She nodded with satisfaction, then began trimming away excess fat with a sharp knife, her movements precise and economical. Nothing was wasted. The trimmings went into a pot for rendering. The bones would make stock. Even in abundance, there was careful stewardship. Gisela watched as Mrs. Davies prepared the roasting pan, rubbing the meat with salt, pepper, and herbs whose names she did not know. Rosemary, Mrs. Davies said, holding up a sprig of the fragrant herb. And thyme. My mother always said these two herbs make proper English roast beef. None of that fancy French cooking, just good, honest flavors. She placed the meat in the pan with vegetables around it, onions, carrots, potatoes, everything arranged with care, as if the appearance mattered as much as the taste. While the meat roasted, filling the kitchen with an aroma that made Gisela's mouth water despite having eaten breakfast, Mrs. Davies turned to the Yorkshire pudding preparation. She measured flour with exacting precision, cracked eggs into a bowl, added milk and a pinch of salt. The secret, she explained to Gisela, speaking slowly so the German woman might understand, is getting the batter smooth and letting it rest. Then the pan must be smoking hot, with proper beef drippings, before you pour it in. That is what makes it rise tall and crispy. Gisela found herself drawn into the ritual despite her initial intention to merely observe. She peeled potatoes under Mrs. Davies's direction, learning that they should be parboiled first, then roughed up with a fork before roasting to create crispy edges. She prepared peas, shelling them from their pods with methodical rhythm. She learned to make proper gravy from pan drippings, flour, and stock, whisking constantly to prevent lumps. Each step had its own small tradition, its own correct method passed down through generations. By late morning, the kitchen had transformed into a production center of remarkable efficiency. Additional staff arrived to help with the final preparations. Serving plates were warmed in the oven. Serving utensils were arranged in precise order. The dining hall was prepared with extra care, tables aligned more perfectly than usual. This was not simply feeding prisoners and guards. This was, as Corporal Fletcher had said, maintaining civilization through ritual and tradition. When noon approached and the food was ready, Gisela stood back and observed the final plating. Each serving was constructed with attention to presentation. Sliced beef arranged just so, Yorkshire pudding placed at the proper angle, vegetables distributed evenly, gravy poured with careful restraint. The plates looked like something from a restaurant, not a prison camp kitchen. August 19, 1945 dawned clear and warm, the summer sun streaming through the barracks windows earlier than usual. Gisela woke to find several of the other women already awake, speaking in hushed German about the day ahead. It was Sunday, and after weeks of observation, they all knew what Sunday meant. But knowing and experiencing remained two very different things, and the anticipation in the barracks carried an almost childlike quality that would have been unthinkable months earlier when they first arrived as prisoners. Morning passed with the usual routines, but everything felt slightly different. The guards seemed more cheerful than normal, greeting the women with genuine warmth rather than professional courtesy. Captain Thornton made her rounds with a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if she knew something the prisoners did not. By 11 in the morning, the aroma of roasting meat began drifting across the compound from the kitchen, and conversations in the barracks stopped mid-sentence as the women caught the scent. Mechthild stood at the window, watching smoke rise from the kitchen chimney. "It smells like my grandmother's house in Stuttgart before the war," she said quietly. "Sunday dinners, when the whole family gathered. I had forgotten that smell existed." Her voice carried such longing that several other women joined her at the window, drawn by shared memories of a life that felt impossibly distant now. Noon approached with building tension. The women assembled in the dining hall as instructed, taking their usual seats at the long wooden tables. The room had been prepared with extra care, Gisela noticed. The tables were cleaner than usual, aligned with perfect precision. Fresh flowers, simple wildflowers from the surrounding countryside, had been placed in jam jars at intervals along each table. The British were treating this meal as something special, even sacred. Captain Thornton entered first, followed by the guards who would be serving. Then came Mrs. Davies and her kitchen staff, pushing metal carts laden with covered serving dishes. The covers were lifted, and collective gasps echoed through the dining hall. The platters contained thick slices of roast beef, still steaming, their surfaces dark and caramelized from roasting. Golden Yorkshire pudding stood tall beside them, their edges crispy and their centers still soft. Roasted potatoes gleamed with rendered fat. Bright green peas formed perfect mounds. Orange carrots lay in neat rows. And over everything, rich brown gravy waited to be ladled generously. Corporal Fletcher began serving the first table, placing plates before each woman with careful attention. When Gisela's plate arrived, she found herself unable to move, unable even to breathe properly. The plate was warm, the food arranged with obvious care, the portions generous beyond anything she had imagined. This was not survival rations. This was not even adequate nutrition. This was abundance, comfort, civilization maintained through food. Her hands trembled as they had weeks ago, but now, for different reasons. Then, she had been confused. Now, she was beginning to understand what this meal represented, and the understanding overwhelmed her completely. The dining hall remained suspended in stunned silence as all 52 German women stared at their plates. Gisela heard Sieglinde beside her whisper in German, her voice shaking with emotion. "This cannot be real. This must be a mistake. Why would they feed us like this?" Around them, similar whispers rippled through the tables as the women struggled to process what they were seeing. Several had tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by the sudden confrontation with abundance after so many months of deprivation. Adelheid, her English now fluent enough for complex questions, raised her hand hesitantly. Corporal Fletcher approached with a concerned expression, clearly worried that something was wrong with the food. "Yes, miss? Is there a problem?" Adelheid struggled to find words, her careful pronunciation faltering with emotion. "Corporal Fletcher, please, we must understand. Today is special British holiday? Is Christmas? Is Easter? Why this food for prisoners?" Her question carried the confusion of all the women, the desperate need to understand why enemies would show such generosity. Fletcher's weathered face softened with comprehension. He glanced at Captain Thornton, who nodded permission for him to respond. "No, miss. No holiday. It's just Sunday, like I told you before. Sunday roast. We do this every Sunday when supplies allow. It's tradition, see? Part of being British, keeping our spirits up, remembering what we're fighting to get back to." His words, translated quickly by Adelheid for those who did not understand English, sent waves of disbelief through the assembled women. Every Sunday. Not a special occasion, not a celebration, just routine. The implications crashed over Gisela like cold water. If this was normal British life, even in wartime, even in a prison camp, then everything she had been told about British suffering was a lie. She thought of the propaganda broadcasts she had listened to in Munich, the newsreels showing supposed British starvation, the official reports claiming Britain was on the verge of collapse. All lies. Meanwhile, British citizens had been eating roast beef every Sunday. Edeltraud began crying openly, her shoulders shaking with sobs she could not control. Herta moved to comfort her, but she was crying too, tears running down her face as she stared at her untouched plate. "I cannot eat this," Edeltraud managed between sobs. "My family in Dresden. They are starving if they even survive the bombing. How can I eat this when they have nothing?" Her anguish expressed what many felt. Guilt at accepting comfort from former enemies while their own families suffered in ruined Germany. But hunger eventually overcame guilt, as it always does. One by one, the women began to eat, tentatively at first, then with increasing intensity as the rich flavors overwhelmed their senses. Gisela cut a small piece of roast beef, placed it in her mouth, and felt tears spring to her eyes. The meat was tender, seasoned perfectly, cooked with obvious skill and care. The Yorkshire pudding was crispy outside and soft inside, the perfect vehicle for gravy. The roasted potatoes had a satisfying crunch. Everything was warm, fresh, prepared with attention, and served with dignity. The British guards watched in silence, many clearly moved by the prisoners' reactions. This was not the response they had expected, this overwhelming emotion, this visible transformation of hardened enemy soldiers into vulnerable young women, confronting kindness they never anticipated. Private Morton wiped her own eyes discreetly, touched by the shared humanity the meal had revealed. As the initial shock subsided and the women continued eating, the dining hall's atmosphere gradually shifted from stunned silence to something approaching normalcy. The act of eating together, prisoners and guards sharing the same meal, prepared with the same care, created a sense of community that transcended their official roles. Gisela found herself acutely aware of every bite, every flavor, every texture. The beef melted on her tongue, its richness almost overwhelming after months of bland, meager food. She forced herself to eat slowly, to make the experience last, knowing that this moment represented something profound beyond mere nutrition. Across the table, Mechthild had abandoned her usual controlled demeanor and was eating with visible pleasure, pausing occasionally to close her eyes and savor particular bites. "I had forgotten," she said quietly in German, "what it feels like to eat food that someone prepared with love rather than obligation. My mother used to cook like this, before the war. Every meal was an act of care. Her words resonated with the other women, many nodding in recognition of memories they had buried under years of military efficiency and wartime deprivation. Sieglinde had stopped crying, but her face remained flushed, her eyes still bright with unshed tears. She cut her Yorkshire pudding with surgical precision, examining its structure with fascination before tasting it. The expression that crossed her face was almost comical in its surprise and delight. "How is this even possible?" she asked no one in particular. "How do you make something this light and crispy from just flour and eggs?" Her question prompted Corporal Fletcher, who was making rounds to ensure everyone had adequate gravy, to launch into an enthusiastic explanation of Yorkshire pudding technique that Adelheid struggled to translate. The guards had begun eating their own meals at a separate table, but the usual rigid separation between captors and prisoners felt less pronounced than normal. Several guards smiled at the women's obvious enjoyment, pleased that their Sunday tradition was having such an impact. Captain Thornton observed from her position near the door, her expression thoughtful. She had overseen many unusual situations during her military career, but watching enemy prisoners weep over roast beef was certainly unprecedented. Yet she understood intuitively that something important was happening, some barrier breaking down that could never be fully reconstructed. Gisela found her attention drawn to the British soldiers as they ate their own portions. They approached the meal with casual familiarity, clearly accustomed to this weekly ritual. They talked among themselves, laughed at shared jokes, exhibited none of the emotional intensity the German women were experiencing. This was normal for them, comfortable, expected. The contrast highlighted just how different British and German wartime experiences had been. While German civilians and soldiers had progressively lost access to adequate food, enduring increasing deprivation as the war dragged on, the British had somehow maintained their traditions and their standards. The organizational capacity required for such maintenance suggested competence and resources that German propaganda had insisted did not exist. As plates began to empty, Gisela felt something shifting inside her. Some fundamental reassessment of everything she thought she understood about the war, about her enemies, about the choices she had made in serving the Reich. This meal was not just food, it was a statement about values, about what societies choose to preserve even under pressure. After the meal concluded, the usual routine called for prisoners to return immediately to their barracks for afternoon rest period. But Captain Thornton made an unusual decision, announcing that the women could remain in the dining hall for an additional hour if they wished. The offer was unprecedented, and most of the German women accepted gratefully, reluctant to leave the warmth and community the shared meal had created. They gathered in small groups around the tables, speaking in low voices, processing the experience together. Corporal Fletcher approached the table where Gisela sat with Sieglinde, Herta, and Adelheid. He carried a pot of tea and several cups, setting them down with a friendly smile. "Thought you ladies might enjoy proper Sunday tea," he said, pouring for each of them without waiting for permission. The gesture was so casually kind that Gisela felt her throat tighten again. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, inhaling the steam, and Fletcher settled into a chair nearby, clearly willing to talk if they were interested. Adelheid, always the bravest with her English, ventured a question. "Corporal Fletcher, please tell us about Sunday roast in your home, before war?" Fletcher's weathered face lit up with obvious pleasure at the memory. "Ah, well now, my mum in Yorkshire, she took Sunday roast very serious-like. Started preparing Saturday night, she did. Had a special roasting pan that belonged to her mum before her. Dad would sharpen the carving knife Saturday evening, making a proper ceremony of it," he continued, his accent growing thicker as he warmed to his subject. "Come Sunday morning, whole house would smell of roasting meat by 10 o'clock. We'd go to church at 8, come home to that beautiful smell. Mum would have the vegetables going, the pudding batter resting. Dinner was always at 1 precisely, never earlier, never later. Dad would carve at the head of table, serving each of us in order, Mum first, then us kids from oldest to youngest. Made us feel like a proper family, you know? Made us feel civilized even when times were hard. The word civilized again. Gisela leaned forward, her limited English struggling to express her question. Civilized? This word, it means? Fletcher considered carefully, wanting to explain something fundamental to someone from a very different culture. Means remembering we're human, miss. Means taking time to do things proper and right, not just surviving, but living with dignity. Sunday roast ain't just about feeding bellies. It's about sitting together, sharing something good, remembering there's more to life than just work and worry. Herta translated this for the others, and silence fell over their group. The concept Fletcher described contradicted everything about total war mobilization, everything about sacrifice for the state, everything they had been taught about subordinating individual comfort to collective victory. The British had fought a total war too, but somehow maintained islands of humanity within it. Germany had abandoned such islands entirely, pursuing victory with single-minded intensity that left no room for Sunday roasts or family dignity. The days following that first Sunday roast dinner found the German women in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. Gisela lay awake at night, her mind churning through memories and revelations that refused to align. She had believed, truly believed, that Germany was fighting defensive war against enemies who wanted to destroy German culture and enslave German people. The propaganda had been constant, reinforced through every communication channel. Radio broadcasts, newsreels, official announcements, officers' speeches. Britain was starving, collapsing, desperately holding on while Germany's superior organization and will would inevitably triumph. But the Sunday roast revealed that narrative as fundamentally false. Britain had not been starving. British citizens had maintained traditions and standards throughout the war. The organizational capacity required to ensure even prison camps could serve proper Sunday dinners suggested a society functioning far better than Germany's increasingly chaotic final months. Everything Gisela had believed about relative British weakness was inverted from reality. The implications terrified her because they suggested her entire understanding of the war might be equally inverted. Mechthild organized what she called a discussion group in the barracks one evening, gathering women willing to speak honestly about their confusion. 15 of them formed a circle, sitting on bunks and floor, speaking in careful German that felt like confession. "We must acknowledge what we are learning," Mechthild began, her administrative precision serving her even in this emotional territory. "The British are not what we were told they were. Therefore, what else were we told that was untrue?" Edeltraud spoke first, her voice barely above whisper. "I believed we were defending Germany against aggression. I believed Britain started the war to destroy us. But if Britain was never weak, never desperate, why would they need to destroy Germany? What were we really fighting for?" Her question hung heavily in the air because it led inevitably to darker questions about what Germany had actually been doing during the war, what the Reich had truly represented. Sieglinde raised her hand hesitantly. "I have been reading newspapers that Dr. Hayes allows in the medical office. British newspapers, American newspapers, they write about camps in Germany, about systematic killing, about things I cannot believe are real. But if the British did not lie about having food, did not lie about their strength, then perhaps they are not lying about the camps either." Her voice broke on the last words, and several women began crying quietly, confronting possibilities too horrific to fully accept. Gisela found herself remembering propaganda films she had seen in Munich, films showing supposed British atrocities, British barbarism, British cruelty to prisoners. Yet here she sat, well-fed, decently treated, shown unexpected kindness by people she had been taught to hate. If the propaganda had lied about British cruelty, it had surely lied about other things too. The edifice of beliefs that had structured her understanding of the world was crumbling, and she had no idea what would replace it. Herta, older and perhaps wiser than most, offered perspective shaped by her medical training. "In nursing, we are taught to trust evidence over assumption," The evidence before us suggests we served a cause built on lies. That is painful truth, but truth nonetheless. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. Late August brought the first substantial mail delivery from Germany through the International Red Cross, and with it came devastating confirmations of what the women had feared. Gisela received a letter from her aunt in a displaced persons camp outside Munich. The news was worse than she had imagined. Her family's home had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in January. Her mother had died in the attack. Her father and younger sister had survived, but were living in rubble, surviving on charity rations, searching desperately for any news of Gisela's fate. She sat on her bunk holding the thin paper, reading and rereading her aunt's careful handwriting. The letter described conditions in Munich with stark honesty. Buildings reduced to shells, streets filled with debris, thousands of displaced people wandering without homes or purpose, food so scarce that people were eating grass and tree bark to survive. Her father, once a proud machinist, was working for occupation authorities in exchange for food. Her sister, only 16, had stopped menstruating from malnutrition. The contrast between their suffering and her own relative comfort in British captivity was almost unbearable. Around the barracks, similar scenes were unfolding. Sieglinde had received news that her entire family in Hamburg was missing, presumed dead in the firestorm bombing of July 1943. She sat motionless on her bunk, the letter fallen from her hands, her face blank with shock. Edeltraud learned that Dresden, already devastated by February's bombing, had been further destroyed in subsequent raids. Her childhood home no longer existed. Her parents' fate remained unknown. Only Herta received what might be considered good news. Her family had survived in a suburb of Berlin, though they were living in damaged housing with minimal resources. But even her relief was tempered by her mother's description of life under Soviet occupation, the fear and uncertainty that defined every day. Mechthild's letter from Stuttgart told of her father's death from typhus in the chaos following Germany's surrender, her mother now dependent on her married brother's family for survival. The letters transformed the women's understanding of their situation. They were prisoners in name, but their daily reality was incomparably better than that of their families in Germany. They ate 3 meals daily while their loved ones starved. They slept in clean beds with adequate blankets while families huddled in ruins. They received medical care while disease spread unchecked through displaced persons camps. The guilt was crushing, but so was a growing recognition that returning to Germany meant returning to conditions worse than captivity. That evening, the women gathered again in their informal discussion group, but the conversation had changed. They were no longer questioning propaganda or processing revelations about British society. They were confronting an immediate, practical decision about their own futures. What do we return to? Mechthild asked bluntly. Starvation? Homelessness? A country that no longer exists in any form we would recognize? Her administrative mind sought practical solutions. But the practical solutions seemed increasingly clear and increasingly impossible to accept. Staying in British captivity was better than German freedom. When the following Sunday arrived on August 26th, the German women approached the dining hall with different expectations than their first experience. The initial shock had passed, replaced by anticipatory understanding. They knew what was coming now, knew that the British would serve another abundant meal, knew that this was genuinely routine rather than exceptional. Yet the knowledge did not diminish the emotional impact. If anything, the confirmation that such abundance was truly weekly made the experience even more profound. Gisela entered the dining hall with Sieglinde and noticed immediately that several of the women had made efforts to improve their appearance. Uniforms had been cleaned more carefully than usual. Hair had been arranged with extra attention. Some had even attempted to repair damaged clothing, stitching torn seams, replacing missing buttons. The preparation suggested a shift in how the women viewed themselves and the meal. They were no longer simply prisoners being fed. They were guests at a cultural ritual, and they wanted to participate appropriately. Mrs. Davies presided over the kitchen with her usual precision. and the meal that emerged was nearly identical to the previous week. Roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, roasted potatoes, vegetables, gravy. The repetition itself was significant. This was not variety for entertainment, but tradition maintained through careful consistency. The British did not need to innovate or surprise. They needed to preserve what defined them, week after week, year after year. As plates were served, Gisela watched her fellow prisoners' reactions. There were still tears, still visible emotion, but different in quality from the previous week. Less shock, more gratitude. Less confusion, more understanding. The women ate with appreciation rather than overwhelmed disbelief. Conversations began earlier in the meal, the dining hall filling with a mixture of German and English as prisoners and guards began genuinely communicating rather than simply coexisting. Adelheid had prepared specific questions for Corporal Fletcher, having spent the week thinking about what she wanted to understand. "Corporal, please explain. How does Britain have food for this every week when Germany had nothing? We were told Britain was starving worse than Germany. Were we told lies about everything?" Her directness surprised Fletcher, but he answered honestly, explaining rationing systems, agricultural policies, food imports from the Empire and from America. His explanation revealed organizational competence and international cooperation that German propaganda had insisted did not exist. Mechthild listened intently, her administrative mind processing the information. After the meal, she gathered several women in the barracks to share what she had learned. The British maintained functional supply chains throughout the war, she explained. They prioritized nutrition for civilian morale. They accepted help from allies rather than pretending self-sufficiency. Everything Germany did wrong, Britain did right. We lost the war before it even started because our system was fundamentally flawed. Her conclusion was harsh, but increasingly undeniable. The Sunday roast was not just a meal, it was evidence of systemic differences between British and German approaches to total war. Britain had fought while maintaining humanity. Germany had abandoned humanity for victory and achieved neither. The women sat in silence, processing implications that extended far beyond food into questions of governance, values, and what kind of society they wanted to be part of going forward. September brought cooler weather and falling leaves, and with the changing season came a subtle but significant shift in camp dynamics. The German women were no longer treated primarily as prisoners, but as displaced persons whose futures remained uncertain. British authorities in London were still debating repatriation procedures, while reports from occupied Germany painted increasingly grim pictures of conditions that gave everyone pause about sending the women back into such chaos. Gisela had begun keeping a diary in English, forcing herself to think and write in her captor's language as a way of processing her transformation. The entries revealed a woman systematically deconstructing her previous worldview and attempting to build something new. "I believed I was serving German defense," she wrote one evening. "I believed our enemies were cruel and barbaric. I believed Germany represented civilization against chaos. Every belief was wrong. Now I must decide what I actually believe, separate from what I was taught." The decision to write in English was itself significant, representing her growing identification with British culture and values. Herta noticed the diary during an evening in the barracks and asked about it in German. "Why do you write in their language?" Gisela considered the question carefully before responding. "Because German words carry German thoughts, German assumptions. To think differently, I must use different words. English forces me to be more direct, less caught in old patterns." Adelheid had become functionally fluent, serving increasingly as the primary translator between prisoners and guards. But her role had evolved beyond simple language conversion into cultural mediation. She found herself explaining British customs to Germans and German perspectives to British, bridging gaps that went far deeper than vocabulary. Captain Thornton had begun consulting with her on matters affecting the prisoners, recognizing that Adelheid understood both communities better than anyone else in the camp. The informal discussion group that Mechthild had organized now met 3 times weekly, functioning almost like a philosophical society. The women debated questions of identity, responsibility, and redemption with intensity that would have seemed impossible months earlier. They were no longer simply processing shock, but actively choosing new frameworks for understanding themselves and their place in a transformed world. Edeltraud, once the most emotionally fragile, had become one of the most thoughtful voices in these discussions. "We cannot change what we were," she argued one evening. "We can only choose what we become. Staying trapped in guilt serves no one. We must find ways to contribute, to make amends through action, rather than suffering." Her words resonated because they offered a path forward beyond paralysis and self-recrimination. The women had been part of a system that committed terrible acts, even if they personally had not participated in the worst atrocities. They could not undo that history, but they could choose different futures, could dedicate themselves to building something better than what they had served. The Sunday roasts had shown them an alternative model of society, one that maintained humanity even under pressure, that treated even enemies with dignity, that valued tradition and community alongside efficiency. October 19, 1945 arrived with official notices from British military authorities. Repatriation procedures were finally being formalized for the German women prisoners. Transportation would be arranged through displaced persons camps in occupied Germany, with eventual release to return to their families or whatever remained of their previous lives. Captain Thornton called an assembly to explain the process, her expression revealing how difficult she found the prospect of sending these women back to the chaos and deprivation they would certainly face. The announcement triggered intense private discussions among the women. For weeks they had known repatriation was inevitable, but the abstract knowledge had allowed them to avoid confronting the actual decision. Now, with official timelines and procedures, the choice became immediate and real. Return to Germany meant returning to families who needed them, to a country that required rebuilding, to the homeland that still defined their identity regardless of how much had changed. But it also meant returning to starvation, to ruins, to a society that would view them as failures, as soldiers who had been captured and corrupted by enemy influence. Gisela sat in the barracks that evening, her English diary open before her, trying to articulate the impossible choice she faced. Her family needed her. Her father and sister were struggling to survive in Munich. Her duty as a daughter demanded she return to help them. But she also knew that returning meant surrendering the transformation she had undergone, the new understanding she had achieved. In Germany, she would be pressured to forget what she had learned, to suppress her recognition of German failures and British virtues, to participate in collective denial about what the Reich had truly represented. Sieglinde faced a different calculation. With her family dead, she had no one waiting in Hamburg. Returning meant going back to nothing, to a destroyed city where she knew no one and had no prospects. Yet staying in Britain meant accepting that she was choosing comfort over duty, that she was abandoning Germany when it needed rebuilding most. The guilt was crushing, but so was the practical recognition that she could contribute more to reconciliation by staying and becoming an example of transformation than by returning to chaos. The women divided into several camps. Some, particularly those with surviving families, felt clear moral obligation to return, regardless of hardships. They would face starvation and ruins with courage, helping to rebuild from the ground level. Others, especially those who had lost everyone, saw no purpose in returning to nothing. They wanted to stay in Britain, to continue the transformation they had begun, to build new lives that honored what they had learned. A third group remained paralyzed by indecision, torn between competing obligations with no clear answer. Captain Thornton had anticipated this division and made a surprising announcement at a second assembly. British authorities would consider requests for extended displaced person status from women who wished to remain temporarily. It was not citizenship, not even permanent residence, but it was permission to stay while sorting out futures. The offer required finding British sponsors willing to house and employ them, demonstrating they would not be burdens on a country already managing its own reconstruction. The 52 German women ultimately divided into two groups after weeks of agonizing deliberation. 28 chose immediate repatriation despite the hardships, feeling duty to families and homeland outweighed personal comfort or transformation. They would return to Germany and face whatever they found there with courage and determination. 24, including Gisela, Sieglinde, Herta, Adelheid, Edeltraud, and Mechthild, chose to request extended displaced person status and remain in Britain. The division was painful but respectful, each woman understanding the other's reasoning even when disagreeing with their conclusions. Those choosing repatriation prepared for departure with mixed emotions. They packed their few possessions, wrote letters to families announcing their return, and participated in farewell gatherings that felt more like family separations than prisoner releases. Many of them had transformed during their captivity, had learned to question propaganda and appreciate their former enemies' humanity. They intended to carry those lessons back to Germany, to become voices for reconciliation and honest reckoning with the past. For those choosing to stay, the process of finding sponsors and employment proved surprisingly manageable. The story of the German women prisoners who wanted to remain in Britain had spread through local communities, touching hearts and inspiring offers of help. Mrs. Davies, the Sunday roast cook, offered to sponsor Sieglinde and teach her proper British cooking. Dr. Hayes arranged for Herta to continue medical training at Reading Hospital, promising to supervise her transition toward nursing certification. Captain Thornton had developed particular respect for Gisela during their months together and personally connected her with a family in Reading who needed a German tutor for their children. The Henderson family, prosperous merchants with business interests in post-war Germany, saw value in their children learning German from someone who could also teach them about German culture and the dangers of propaganda. Gisela would live with them, teach their children, and continue her own education in English language and British society. Adelheid's fluency made her valuable to British authorities managing occupation zones in Germany. She was offered civilian employment as translator and cultural liaison, work that would allow her to bridge British and German communities while earning proper salary. Mechthild's administrative skills found placement with a reading manufacturing company desperate for organized record-keeping as they converted from wartime to peacetime production. Edeltraud, the youngest and most emotionally scarred, was sponsored by a local church group who saw her as their mission project in practical Christianity. The final gathering before repatriation brought all 52 women together one last Sunday for a final roast beef dinner. Mrs. Davies had prepared the meal with extra care, knowing its symbolic importance. The dining hall filled with tears and embraces as women who had arrived as strangers and enemies prepared to separate as friends and sisters. They had shared transformation that few would understand, had supported each other through psychological reconstruction that would define the rest of their lives. Some would return to Germany, carrying lessons about their former enemies. Others would remain in Britain, carrying responsibility to honor what they had learned through how they lived. 20 years later, October 1965, Gisela Thornton, having taken her sponsor family's name through adoption and later marriage to their eldest son, stood in the converted grounds of what had once been the Reading POW camp. The facility had been transformed into a community center, the barracks replaced by a public library, the dining hall now serving as an event space for local gatherings. She had brought her teenage daughter Emma to show her where her mother's transformation had begun 2 decades earlier. Emma, fluent in both German and English, listened with fascination as her mother described arriving as a frightened prisoner, expecting cruelty, finding unexpected kindness instead. The Sunday roast changed everything, Gisela explained, her English now completely fluent, with only the slightest accent. I thought it was Christmas because I could not imagine enemies feeding us so well. When I learned it was simply Sunday, just normal British tradition, everything I believed collapsed. If they had lied about British starvation, what else had they lied about? The simple act of maintaining civilization through weekly ritual had revealed to Gisela and her fellow prisoners that their entire understanding of the war had been inverted. The British were not barbaric enemies clinging to survival. They were a functional society maintaining values and traditions even under pressure. Germany had abandoned such traditions in pursuit of total victory, and in doing so had lost not just the war, but its moral foundation. Gisela had built a remarkable life in Britain. She worked as senior translator for international business, helped German refugees navigate British society, and served on reconciliation committees that brought together British and German citizens for healing dialogue. Her story had been featured in newspapers and radio programs as an example of redemption and the power of human kindness to overcome hatred. But she never forgot the women who had chosen differently, who had returned to Germany to help rebuild. Many of those women had written to her over the years. They described the incredibly difficult work of reconstruction, the moral reckoning Germany was undergoing, the slow, painful process of acknowledging what the Reich had done and choosing different values going forward. Several had become teachers, explicitly teaching younger Germans about propaganda and the importance of questioning official narratives. Others worked in social services, helping displaced persons and refugees with compassion shaped by their own experiences. The legacy of that Sunday roast extended beyond individual lives into broader Anglo-German reconciliation. The story had influenced how British occupation authorities approached German civilians, emphasizing dignity and reconstruction over punishment. It had demonstrated that treating former enemies with humanity could produce genuine transformation rather than breeding resentment. The women who stayed in Britain and those who returned to Germany both served as bridges between the two countries, proof that former enemies could become friends, that redemption was possible through choice and action. Standing in the autumn sunshine, Gisela reflected on the question that had defined her transformation. What did she choose to believe separate from what she had been taught? She had chosen to believe in human dignity, in the possibility of change, in societies that maintain civilization even under pressure. The Sunday roast had been a simple meal, but it had represented profound values that she had spent 20 years trying to honor through how she lived.